So, happy Easter. Oh, it's not Easter, I know that. I do know that. But this story that we're going to look at tonight from the book of Exodus is the story that the gospel writers had in mind when they talked about Jesus and resurrection. One way of looking at the book of Exodus, this book of revolutionary religion that I'm asking you to read during January and February, you should be up to chapter 14 if you're compliant, and if you're rebellious, it doesn't matter, and I like that too. But one way to look at the book of Exodus is, it is a story of a people who found liberation through their relationship with God, who was led by a model or pattern of leadership, the person of Moses. And it would be enough, in the language of the Hebrew Testament, Dainu, it would be enough if it was just that story, because just that story alone of how a people went from slavery to freedom based in their spirituality has inspired many people, many movements. Next month is Black History Month here at Cathedral of Hope. We will again reverence how the African American civil rights movement was a deeply spiritual, religious movement, the patterns of liberation of which are told in the book of Exodus. I'm reading a novel right now by Sue Monk Kidd called The Invention of Wings. It's an Oprah choice, and it's a thrilling part of the book right now where we're in Charleston, South Carolina, before the Civil War, in the African church, as it's called, the slave church, and they're reading and telling the stories of resistance and rebellion in the book of Exodus and other parts of the Hebrew Testament that they had been forbidden to read up until that point. This is a revolutionary book. The book of Exodus incites revolution. It would be enough if it had just done it in the past. But I also believe that Jesus was able to achieve the revolution that he experienced that we call resurrection because he knew this story so intimately. And this particular story in Exodus 14 is the pattern of resurrection. You can call it revolution, you can call it resurrection, you can call it reformation, you can call it rebirth or renaissance, change, renewal. It's all there. Jesus lived with this story in his imagination so that when it came time for resurrection, it seemed natural and inevitable. And I hope that by our looking at Exodus and by our keying into, as we go into March and April, the Lenten story, the way to Jerusalem with Jesus, that we will see that these ancient stories, whether it's the book of Exodus or the resurrection of Jesus, will inspire us to say, it's not enough that it happened then, here and now, God. Do you know what I was praying while you were singing and creating for us this environment of praise? This phrase was my prayer, here and now, God, here and now. Here and now. Let the Holy Spirit come upon me here and now. Change me here and now. I don't want to wait till I'm better. I don't want to wait till I'm more organized. I don't want to wait till I have a strategic plan. I don't want to wait till Easter. Here and now. The people of Israel had reached their here and now point at this point in Exodus 14. Now, I can tell some of you have been reading the other chapters because you've come up to me and said, what is with this weird chapter 4 where, well, it involves a foreskin. That's all I'm going to say. And normally I wouldn't even use language like that in church, but it's in the Bible. So that's how I know that those of you who have been following along in the text have actually read it, because a number of you now have come to me and said, what is with this weird passage? Keep reading. Keep reading to Exodus 14. Read through all the plagues and get to the Red Sea part, because that's where we're at tonight. The Red Sea, the revolution, the here and now moment, the resurrection. Not just a person, but a whole people. So in Exodus 13, Moses has been to see Pharaoh and has said this simple thing: we're done here. Let us go. We are not going to be complicit in our oppression anymore. So you can let us go, or we're going to go anyway. And things could get difficult for you if you try to stand in the way of a people's liberation. And finally, you read the story, Moses and the people of Israel are given leave to go by Pharaoh after the plagues in particular. And Moses and the people leave with just what they can carry and Joseph's bones to remind them of how they got into this mess. And they go toward the promised land. They go to return home. But of course, it's 500 years later, so home isn't home anymore. Home is somewhere new. And as they have left, immediately after they're leaving, Pharaoh says to himself, and the other people say, "Wait a minute, what are we thinking? Just kidding. Come back. We are dependent upon our slaves. We need your oppression in order for us to survive," thus revealing their own need for liberation too. It's never just the obvious oppressed who need liberation. When there is a circumstance of liberation and oppression, everybody needs liberation. So Pharaoh says, "No, just kidding, come back." And it's at this moment that I believe Moses understood that it was not going to be easy. They'd done as much as they thought they could do, but the hardest part still remained. They themselves had to participate in their own liberation. It wasn't enough for Pharaoh to let them go, because Pharaoh can take it back. They had to experience a quality of liberation that could not be rescinded, that could not be taken from them. Frederick Douglass said this in the 19th century, deeply committed, a former slave, to abolition of slavery and also to suffrage, to women's right to vote, all women, black women and white women at that time. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice which will be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Moses, I'm sure, would understand what Frederick Douglass was saying. And so, as they proceeded to leave, as the Red Sea appeared before them, they became aware that they were being followed by Pharaoh, who had decided to take back what wasn't his to give. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. And it was here that they did what all oppressed people do when faced with the prospect of liberation. They formed 4 competing political parties in order to divide them from each other so that they would not strategically overcome the far more overwhelming threat to their liberation embodied by Pharaoh and his army. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness?" These were the let's just drown party. the morose Eeyore party that said, "Ugh, this church has been through too much. I just don't want to do it anymore. I just give up." And then others said to Moses, "What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." This was the political faction that wanted to negotiate with Pharaoh and see if they could return to the former circumstance of their oppression. They romanticized the time of slavery. They thought about the times when they were coming out and the only bars they could go to didn't have names on them, just addresses, and where they could not touch each other and where the police could come in. And they said, that wasn't so bad. Let's go back to living in the dark, in slavery, in oppression. That wasn't so bad. Let's go back. We don't have to change the church. Let's just keep going the way we were. And maybe nothing bad will happen again. Others said, or Moses then said to them, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and see the deliverance that God will accomplish for you today." This is the political faction that said, you know what? Wasn't that great back there? And our odds, they're not so great now. But we're not going back, and we're going to fight. We're going to fight or struggle or do the hard work that it takes to not get the same result over and over and over again. And Moses also said, when this attracted another group of people, God will fight for you. You only have to keep still. You only have to trust God. These are related to the third group. But they were more firm in their faith, even believing that if they did their work, God would do God's work too. So there they were, Egypt's army advancing, and they were fighting among each other. Let's just give up. Oh, let's go back. We can do this. Everybody just pray. It'll be all right. God says to Moses, "What are you doing praying? Stop praying and do something." That's how the rabbis interpret this verse. Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites, go forward. They said that God actually admonished Moses for his long prayers and said, sometimes you have to pray and sometimes you have to do something. They're not mutually exclusive, but God felt that the balance was a little off with Moses in that moment because Moses realized that he was praying partly in order to avoid doing. Not all spirituality is liberating. So Moses stood there and kept praying and did as God commanded and stretched out his hand over the sea. Now, there are numerous legends, midrash, they're called tales from the rabbis about what happened to cause this moment, this revolution moment, this resurrection moment. Resurrection is not linear. Moses' resurrection began when in the desert, recovering from his humiliation and failure, God said to him, "People make mistakes, Moses. Now get up. I need you to go do something." And Moses said, "Here I am. Hineni, here am I. Resurrection isn't just about that one moment. If you look back, you can see times in which you have been practicing it all along. Moses somehow summoned from within himself that part that said yes to God, the part that went to Pharaoh and said, we're out of here and you can't stop us. Whatever it was in that moment, Moses summoned it and put out his hand. And the rabbis say that there was a great wind that took place, and that wind had started at the time of creation, so that this moment of liberation would be possible. God never intends us to spend eternity in oppression. Even at creation, God sent the winds that would part the waters of the sea at just the right moment. The moment, the here and now moment, where the desire to move forward is greater than the desire to give up or go back to Egypt. One rabbinical story says that there was Moses praying, there were the Egyptians coming down on them, there were the people trembling. Moses puts out his hand and nothing happens. And one slave who said, I will never go back, stepped into the water even before the waters parted. He stepped in up to his knees. Everyone's pointing in the way that people are sometimes not very helpful when someone is trying to achieve a revolution on their behalf. And then a second step, and the water got deeper. And a third step, and the water got deeper. A fourth step, up to his neck, up to his nostrils. And then when he took that last step, the waters parted. And because he lived into it before he or anyone else could see it, it happened. That's how resurrection is. When you cannot and are willing to release whatever it takes to not go back, even if you can't yet imagine how it will look different, then the waters part and the night of miracles takes place. And it doesn't just happen once. It's not linear. It's not particular. It can happen every night when the waters part. The legends of the time say that there was a vault 600 miles high formed by the waters that had parted. And because, in their worldview, the world was flat. This is not a science lesson, it's the Bible. Everyone all over the world could see that there was a great vault formed by waters that had separated, and could feel the power of miracle unfolding in that moment. Because resurrection doesn't just happen to one person in isolation. There's a tangible, communal, contagious quality to hope. Only one needed to step forward, and then one by one, they stepped into the waters. Moses first, Moses last. We don't know. There are many stories about what happened to them in that distance between leaving the shores of Egypt and landing on the shores of the Promised Land. The legends say that the ground was dry for them, that they could see not just one path, but 12 paths, one for each of the tribes of Israel, because anyone who goes into liberation is welcome to return, goes into oppression, is welcome to return to liberation. It was a guarantee that everyone would happen for everyone if they wanted it. And the waters were clear, they could see each other as they were walking through on dry land in this miracle moment of revolution and resurrection. Some legends say that they could see in the water pomegranates and other sustenance, because God never intends for us to starve or be hungry or be thirsty when we're on the path to liberation, spiritually or materially. Here's what I believe. I can't prove it, but I believe it. They went in, and Pharaoh's army followed, and those who were unwilling to leave their chariots or other encumbrances of oppression were mired and unable to make the transition at that time to resurrection. It's painful, but I'm not sure that it's all Israelites only who went in and only Israelites who made it out. I think that something happened in the waters, in the moments between our old life and our new life. Everything's up for grabs. New alliances can be made, new choices, new companions on the journey. Some Israelites may not have been ready to go yet. Some Egyptians were shamed by their complicity in the oppression of the Israelites. Together they entered. Only those clinging to oppression were unable to proceed to liberation. I think this is what Jesus had in mind. And his resurrection didn't start in the garden. His resurrection began every time he said, "Be healed." Every time he stood up for the rights of others and challenged religious and political authorities, challenged himself and challenged his own people to live differently, to live more fully the beloved community. So that in that one moment, that glorious moment between this life and what's next, it just seemed natural. It just seemed easy to go from one to the next. This is a powerful story, and I hope we can pray it and live it together as Cathedral of Hope and live into resurrection. Easter isn't just April 20th. I just could not wait to April 20th to think and talk about Easter. Looking forward to Lent, love the morbid hymns, love it all. But you know what? It's not linear. What gets me through the suffering, hard work, whatever it is that we have to do to achieve, we all have it, and we have it together, is the sure and certain knowledge of resurrection. I think that they knew God did not lead them into the wilderness to die there. And God did not lead them out of Egypt so that they could go back. God is calling us, Cathedral of Hope, to a revolution, to a transformation, to a renewal, to a rebirth, to a resurrection. Happy Easter.